Our next topic this morning shall discuss about the upcoming big change in 2015. We are very honored to have a distinguished speaker from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Secretariat based in Jakarta, Indonesia. Before joining the ASEAN, he was the international consultant and advisor of the ADB here in Manila. He was a senior manager for transfer pricing and head center for the economic excellence of PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, Toronto, Canada. He was also the chief economist and assistant vice president of the Development Bank of Singapore, Philippines, Inc., and likewise a member of the Academe. Excuse me. Today, he is a director and chief economist of the ASEAN Integration Monitoring Office. He spearheads the implementation of regional surveillance and economic monitoring in the ASEAN, and he provides high-level policy and technical advice and recommendations to support ASEAN's economic integration initiatives. Aladdin, as he's known, is among others an Atenean, and my and Francis Papa's batchmates back in '83. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all welcome our next speaker, Dr. Aladdin Rillo.
Thank you very much, Mitch, for the kind introduction. Yeah, Mitch and I were classmates back in Ateneo in 1983, although he looks much younger than I do. But it's true that we're classmates back then, including Mr. Papa there. Okay. I'm very pleased to be here today and to talk about the ASEAN Economic Community. As you know, by 2015, the regional economic landscape is going to change with the establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community. But before I go to the description of what AEC is all about, let me just again say that I'm from the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta. ASEAN Secretariat is a regional organization that is responsible for implementing and coordinating regional economic initiatives as well as political and social initiatives in the region. In fact, I have the honor to meet Deputy Commissioner Vida Chong every year because one of the areas that I'm handling at the ASEAN Secretariat is the cooperation in insurance. So every year, the ASEAN insurance regulators have their meeting to discuss issues related to insurance cooperation in ASEAN. As I said earlier, I'm very honored to be here and to address insurance professionals and practitioners. I'm not an insurance practitioner, I'm an economist by training and profession. But this particular event for us is very important, particularly for the ASEAN Secretariat, because we always believe that it is very important to engage with the private sector in building the ASEAN Economic Community. As we all know, ASEAN Economic Community is a market-driven process, and in order for ASEAN economic integration to work, it is vital that the private sector, including the insurance industry, for example, is involved in the process. I've been asked by the organizers to talk about the AEC and what is in store for us by 2015. So in my presentation today, I'm going to discuss briefly what is AEC, what are the different characteristics of ASEAN Economic Community, and what do we expect by 2015 and beyond. And then I'll try to link it up with what's the implication on the ASEAN insurance markets, including, in particular, the implications on the Philippine insurance market. Okay, by way of introduction, ASEAN Economic Community is a work in progress that started 15 years ago. It actually started in 1997 when the ASEAN leaders came up with a vision of what ASEAN will be in the coming years. In 1997, they developed what they call as the ASEAN Vision 2020. The idea is to create a stable, prosperous, and highly competitive economic region in the coming years. Of course, in 1997, there was no mention yet of ASEAN Economic Community or ASEAN Economic Integration. It was actually only in 2003, during the summit in Bali, Indonesia, that the leaders decided to focus on creating an ASEAN Economic Community as an end goal of regional economic integration. The original idea is to establish AEC by 2020, but later on, there was a decision to accelerate the establishment of AEC by 2015. I think that particular decision was made in 2008, in January, during the summit here in Cebu in the Philippines. Since then, efforts have been intensifying on how to achieve this AEC by 2015. In fact, in 2007, the ASEAN leaders came up with this AEC blueprint that contains the strategic schedules as well as the different measures that would enable the region to achieve AEC by 2015. In 2008, ASEAN had also formulated the ASEAN Charter that makes ASEAN a more legally based economic institution. Just in April this year, during the summit in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, the ASEAN leaders reiterated their commitment to the establishment of AEC. Next. Sorry. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, ASEAN Economic Community by itself is a strategy developed by ASEAN leaders to achieve economic integration in ASEAN. The way it is envisioned is that there is a need to enhance the competitiveness of ASEAN as a region by creating a bigger market and a unified trading bloc. The enhancement of competitiveness within the region and among ASEAN countries, the way the leaders envision it, can be undertaken or can be accomplished by eliminating all barriers related to markets. At the same time, there is a need to reduce transaction costs that prevent business to flourish effectively within the region and among countries in the region. So this is basically what the AEC is all about in terms of how do we envision it within ASEAN. So how do we achieve the AEC? The strategy in achieving the AEC is quite simple. What the ASEAN leaders in mind is to transform ASEAN into a bigger market, into a competitive market of 600 million people and an economy amounting to like $2 trillion. The idea is that by creating a bigger market, by creating a unified trading bloc, ASEAN will be able to become more competitive. And the result of this increased competition in the region and among countries in ASEAN, there will also be a tendency to spill over the effects of this integration into more equitable economic development in the region. And at the same time, ASEAN being involved in integrating itself with the rest of the world. So basically what we have here is a simple strategy on how to achieve the AEC. It also contains the different pillars by which AEC is being premised on, in terms of creating a single market and production base, in terms of creating a highly competitive economic region, in terms of a region that is fully integrated with the rest of the world, and a region that is able to address some development challenges. So let me briefly discuss what are the different characteristics of the AEC, just to give you an idea of where the region is heading by 2015 and beyond. As a single market and production base, the idea again is to create economies of scale in the region. These economies of scale is translated in terms of an increase in the size of the market economy in the region, which as of today is around $2 trillion, and at the same time to increase the ability of ASEAN to compete with the rest of the world as a unified trading bloc. The question now is, how do we create this single market and production base, and what does it imply? One implication of this single market and production base is that we're trying to establish regional production networks in the region, which means that within the region, countries within ASEAN should be able to supply inputs that would enable the region or each individual country in the ASEAN to develop this production network. The question now is, how is that made possible? That is made possible in terms of facilitating this production, these inputs of production. What I'm saying is that in order to create a single market and production base, ASEAN has envisioned, for example, free movement of goods within the region. This free movement of goods can be facilitated, for example, by eliminating tariff barriers by 2015 and beyond. The free movement of goods can also be made possible by ensuring or by gradually eliminating non-tariff barriers to integration to markets. At the same time, single market and production base also implies that there will be free movement of services within the region. For example, in the case of the insurance industry, we expect that by 2015 and beyond, because of this services liberalization, insurance services can move freely from one country to another by 2015 and beyond. We also envision that through this single market and production base, there will be more opportunities for investments outside countries in the region. For example, Philippine investors now will be able to invest in Indonesia and other countries within ASEAN, because within ASEAN, we're trying to facilitate the movement of investments as well by providing ASEAN investors the same national treatment and the same privileges as other investors within the region. We also envision that in order to create this single market and production base, there should be free movement of labor within ASEAN. I'm pleased to inform you that during the next summit in Cambodia next month, ASEAN leaders are going to sign the first landmark agreement on the movement of natural persons. This agreement on the movement of natural persons would allow professionals within the region to move from one country to another, and at the same time would allow skilled labor to move freely across countries in the region. Finally, the single market and production base can be made possible by ensuring that capital can be accessed anywhere in the region. I think one very good example of this initiative on allowing freer flow of capital is ASEAN exchanges or linkages. ASEAN exchanges or linkages allows, for example, the interlink of different stock markets in the region. So far, 2 countries are now implementing that particular initiative, Singapore and Malaysia. Thailand is going to join the implementation this year, and hopefully the Philippines will join these ASEAN exchanges by next year. The idea again is that by allowing the free movements of factors of production within the region, ASEAN should be able to create this single market and production base. Similarly, AEC envisions that we want a region by 2015 that is highly competitive. And by competitiveness here, we at the ASEAN Secretariat, we try to equate competitiveness in terms of 6 priorities. And these priorities consist of competition policy, intellectual property rights, consumer protection, infrastructure and connectivity, taxation, and e-commerce. Again, just to further clarify it, under competition policy, the idea within the region is to allow each country within ASEAN to develop or to formulate a competition policy that would allow greater contestability of markets. Currently, within the region, we are now trying to develop some regional best practices so that there will be greater competition within each country in the region. In the area of infrastructure and connectivity, for example, ASEAN 2 years ago has adopted what we call as the ASEAN Master Plan on Connectivity. Again, we want to make sure that ASEAN economic integration is not only an abstract thing that people discuss at the regional level. We want to make sure that there are some concrete results of this AEC. Through this ASEAN Master Plan on ASEAN connectivity, we're trying to connect the countries in the region through increased infrastructure. We also try to allow connectivity in terms of people-to-people connection. At the same time, there is connectivity in terms of institutional interrelationship among countries in the region. Another good development here is in the area of taxation. One of the things that private sector always raise in our meetings is that the need for ASEAN to address tax-related impediments to integration. Again, I'm happy to inform you that now there is a working committee within ASEAN that tries to address taxation issues within the region. Issues related, for example, to double taxation and issues related to withholding taxes. So those issues we believe and we feel are very important in order to achieve a more integrated ASEAN by 2015. At the same time, the region is very much aware of the fact that in creating a bigger market and in creating a competitive economic region, we have to ensure that the benefits of integration would be distributed equally among countries and among peoples in ASEAN. And that is why if you look at the AEC, one of the important pillars of the AEC is the need to have equitable economic distribution in the region. And the way this particular pillar is being addressed in the region is by looking at two important initiatives. One is the development of SME. Again, there are regional bodies within ASEAN that try to address issues related to SME development. There is a strategic development plan that is being created within the region that tries to address concerns by SMEs, particularly issues related to access to financing, issues related to capacity building, and issues related to marketing incentives and so forth. At the same time, we recognize that given the fact that ASEAN is very diverse, we have the most developed economies like Singapore and Brunei, and at the same time, we have the poorest economies in the region like Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos. In order to address this development gap, we also have this initiative called Initiative for ASEAN Integration that tries to address concerns by the smaller economies in ASEAN so that by 2015 and beyond, these smaller economies should be able to actively participate in the wider integration of the region. Finally, one important component of this AEC is the fact that as ASEAN continues to integrate internally, we also recognize that ASEAN cannot afford to ignore what's happening outside the region. And that is the reason why part of the AEC is the recognition that there is a need for ASEAN countries to integrate as well with the rest of the world. And this is very much evident in the various initiatives that the region has implemented so far. For example, ASEAN has free trade agreements with 6 countries: China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand. So these are basically bilateral FTAs that we have developed with these dialogue partners to ensure that there is greater flow of investments and trade from ASEAN across these different countries. And at the same time, we have just recently developed this regional comprehensive economic partnership. This is basically an FTA that is much wider in scope because the idea behind the regional economic comprehensive partnership is for ASEAN as one entity to establish free trade arrangement with the +6 countries. These +6 countries include Japan, China, Korea, India, New Zealand, and Australia. Again, this is a new initiative that ASEAN leaders have decided to develop, and this particular initiative is going to be launched at the next summit next month in Cambodia. So the question now is, what have we achieved so far? As I mentioned earlier, the idea of building the ASEAN Economic Community started in 2003. And then from 2003 onwards, we're trying to establish AEC by 2015. So the relevant question now is to what extent we're able to achieve and what results have been achieved so far. This particular slide gives you the actual implementation status of the AEC. in terms of the different initiatives we have implemented. As of April, this was the slide that we presented to the ASEAN leaders in April. ASEAN has implemented around 68% of the measures under the AEC blueprint. This means that 68% of measures that ASEAN has developed over the years have already been implemented from 2008 to 2011. That means that there's still a number of pending measures that need to be addressed here. Around 28% of measures under the AEC are yet to be implemented. Most of these measures are due to are left being unimplemented because of some implementation bottlenecks. One important issue here within the region, for example, is that countries in the region have difficulty transforming the regional economic agreements into their domestic laws and processes. And I think that is very crucial because the failure of each individual economy to transform regional agreements into domestic economic laws will affect the implementation of ASEAN economic community. At the same time, we also recognize that across countries in the region, there is still very limited understanding of what AEC is all about. I think that is the reason why, if you look at the implementation rate of AEC, it's still very limited, only 68%, because even within each individual country in the region, there is the understanding of what AEC is all about is very limited. I think that is the reason why ASEAN Secretariat, me in particular, welcome this opportunity to address the private sector, because we always believe that in order for AEC to become effective or to become successful in the coming years, market players should be able to be involved as well. This brings me to the next topic of my presentation, and this is basically what this presentation is all about. What do we expect by 2015? As I mentioned earlier, AEC is a market-driven process. In order for AEC to become established, to become successful, we have to ensure that ASEAN as a whole is able to address the concerns of the private sector, the markets. Here, I have indicated three important core issues that the private sector would always raise every time there is a dialogue like this. These issues related to the fact that ASEAN is a very small market, issues related to the existence of these unnecessary costs that prevent business to flourish in the region. And at the same time, there is always the concern that there is a high degree of unpredictability in doing business in ASEAN. The question now is to what extent ASEAN or AEC has been able to address these concerns by the private sector. Let me go to this issue one by one. In terms of the concern about ASEAN as a very small market, I think that is the reason why we're trying to create the AEC. By creating a single unified market, we're trying to increase the economies of scale, create a bigger market of 600 million people, a market amounting to around $2 trillion US. And that is made possible by the fact that a number of initiatives now have been implemented to address that. For example, within the region, tariffs among ASEAN 6 countries are already down to zero. Of course, with the other smaller economies, tariff rates for goods in certain industries are still around 0 to 5%. But the idea here is that by 2015, tariffs on goods in the region will be eliminated. And at the same time, by 2015, we try to ensure that non-tariff barriers will also be gradually eliminated over time. These non-tariff barriers would include, for example, inefficient customs administration, issues related to logistics, and so forth. We're not saying here that by 2015 everything will be okay. We're just saying here that by now until 2015, all these non-tariff barriers will be gradually eliminated. On the issue related to the existence of these unnecessary costs, again, within the region, we have implemented a number of measures that try to facilitate trade and investment in ASEAN. As I mentioned earlier, There are initiatives that try to address concerns related to customs administration. We're trying to create or integrate customs in the region. We have, I don't know if you've heard about the ASEAN single window that tries to facilitate the processing of customs documents across countries in the region. The ASEAN single window is now being implemented on a pilot basis in 6 countries, including the Philippines. The expectation is that by 2015, all countries should be able to participate in this ASEAN single window, which involves basically single processing of one single document to facilitate movement of goods and goods and investments in ASEAN. Finally, on the issue of unpredictability, again, this is one important issue that we try to address within the AEC. As I mentioned earlier, there are initiatives that try to improve competition policy and to enhance the contestability of ASEAN markets. There are initiatives related to ensuring that taxation issues are being addressed. And also there are initiatives or measures that try to protect investors in the region. We have within ASEAN an existing dispute settlement mechanism that makes sure that investors are well protected when they come and invest across countries in the region. This particular slide basically shows us what to expect or what are the economic benefits of this AEC. There is a simulation study that was conducted by Mr. Fullman from University of Hawaii that tries to capture what will be the impact of establishing AEC by 2015. And according to that particular study, the establishment of the AEC by 2015 would lead to much lower prices in the region, for consumers in particular. It would also lead to lower costs to producers, and at the same time, it would lead to much higher exports and investments across countries in the region. In particular, the study shows that when AEC is established by 2015, real GDP or real income in the region will increase by around $69 billion from the baseline, which is 2008. For example, in 2008, ASEAN GDP is around $1.5 trillion. Therefore, by 2015, according to this simulation study, we expect a much higher real GDP in the region. I think this is very important, particularly for insurance professionals like you, considering that insurance industry depends so much on real economic conditions. So the establishment of AEC by 2015 is expected to lead to an increased real GDP by around $69 billion. It will also lead to an increase in per capita GDP. Again, the expectation is that per capita GDP will increase by 17 to 26%. This is for ASEAN 5 countries, including the Philippines. But for smaller ASEAN economies like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, we expect that there will be some productivity improvements as a result of this AEC. FDI is also expected to increase through AEC because of the fact that we're trying to eliminate all barriers to markets. So by 2015, the expectation is that FDI's tax will increase by 0.5 to 1% of GDP. And finally, because of the creation of regional production networks, we expect exports to increase by around 45% from 2008, which is the baseline. Again, the question is that, and this is the question that is always asked by private sector every time we have a dialogue, are we going to have an AEC by 2015? I think just to make sure that we don't have false expectations here, what we're trying to say here is that AEC is still a work in progress. By 2015, we're not saying that the market or the region is a fully integrated economic region. What we're simply saying here is that from now until 2015, we expect more competition in the region. We expect more liberalization, more integration. And that is a function of the fact that from now until 2015 and beyond, because of the different measures that we have implemented in the region, barriers to integration are expected to go down. These barriers would consist, for example, barriers related to market efficiency. These barriers can be also related to regulations and policies. What we're simply saying here is that from now until 2015 and beyond, because of the different initiatives in the region through the AEC, market barriers will be eliminated gradually. And at the same time, by 2015 and beyond, we expect more competition, more liberalization, and more integration. I just want to make sure that there are no false expectations here, because I think in some countries that we have visited in ASEAN, people think that by 2015 everything will change. I don't think that is the idea here. Even in the EU took so many years before they come up with this European Union, but until now, the EU is still saddled with a lot of problems. Same thing with ASEAN here. The reality is that by 2015, we don't expect a fully integrated market. By 2015, there will be some results in terms of more competition and integration, but then by 2015, everything is still work in progress until we get to that point where there is a full integration. And the question is, when will that happen? We don't know. But if you look at this graph, we try to illustrate here that market integration is a function of this, the ability of the region to eliminate barriers. From time T1, 2012, which is now, until 2015, we're trying to eliminate these barriers to integration. And at the same time, from now until 2015 and beyond, we expect more competition and liberalization. Now let me go to the third topic of my presentation, which is the implication of this AEC to the ASEAN insurance markets. I think one direct implication of the AEC on the insurance industry or insurance market is on the initiative related to facilitating free movement of services in ASEAN. The idea here is that by 2015 and beyond, we're trying to remove restrictions that would allow countries in each, producers in each individual economy in the region to provide more supply of services across countries in ASEAN. The Philippines has signed this important regional agreement called AFAS, that is the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services. This is the legal agreement that is the basis of financial services liberalization in ASEAN. AFAS is similar to the GATS agreement at the WTO. But at the regional level, we have this version called AFAS. And under AFAS, the idea is that we try to remove restrictions on the different modes of supply in order to facilitate movement of financial services in ASEAN. Liberalization under the AFAS framework can take different forms. One form of liberalization is, for example, cross-border supply, meaning that an insurance provider in the Philippines can supply an insurance coverage or product in another country. That is cross-border supply. That is one form of liberalization. Another form of liberalization here is what we call consumption abroad. Again, in simple terms, this simply means that if you are a consumer in the Philippines, and if you go to another country, let's say Indonesia, under AFAS, you should be able to purchase an insurance coverage in other countries. So that is one form of this free movement of services. Another form of liberalization under AFAS is what we call commercial presence. I think this is a more advanced form of liberalization under ASEAN, in a sense that under this particular mode of supply, investors or companies in the Philippines, for example, can establish their commercial presence in another country, let's say Indonesia, and operate as if that company is like an Indonesian company. So that is the kind of liberalization that we're looking at under the Mode 3 of AFAS. Finally, and I think the most controversial one, is the movement of natural persons, meaning that if you are an insurance professional here in the Philippines, under AFAS, you should be able to practice your profession in other countries in the region. And again, that is still subject, of course, to regulation in each individual country. But as I mentioned earlier, once this agreement on movement of natural persons is signed next month, countries will start working on what they can commit in terms of allowing professionals from the Philippines, for example, to move in other countries in ASEAN. So the idea, again, is that under the movement of natural persons, countries like the Philippines will have to have some commitments, meaning that what are the things by which professionals from abroad, for example, can come to the Philippines? What can the Philippines commit? In the same manner that other countries in ASEAN should be able to make those commitments to allow professionals from other ASEAN countries to practice their profession in Indonesia, Singapore, and so forth. This particular slide shows us what the Philippines has committed so far. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the Philippines is a signatory of the AFAS agreement. Financial liberalization in the Philippines, or financial services liberalization in the Philippines and ASEAN countries, actually started in 1998. In 1998, the Philippines already made some commitments on what are the financial services subsectors that the Philippines, that time, was willing to open up with the rest of the countries in the region. Of course, part of that commitments made in 1998 was the liberalization of the insurance market. Since 1998 until now, there are, I think, there are 5 protocols or agreements that have been signed. Liberalization, the way it's undertaken in ASEAN, is through negotiations, meaning that the Philippines will make an offer to other countries in terms of what type of services that the Philippines can offer, and then other countries should be able to also agree to that commitment. This particular slide basically shows us the degree of liberalization in the ASEAN, in the Philippine insurance market. As you can see here, the Philippines insurance market has become more open over the years. For example, the Philippines has made commitments into different subsectors within the insurance market, like life insurance, non-life, reinsurance, and retrocession, insurance intermediation, services auxiliary to insurance. So these are the different subsectors that the Philippines has committed so far, except for the one on insurance intermediation. So meaning that under that agreement called AFAS, the Philippines has agreed to open up these different subsectors. And the figures represent the degree of the liberalization rate that the Philippines has achieved over the years. And let me just mention that this liberalization rate mainly refers to the ability of the country like the Philippines to eliminate restrictions on the different modes of supply in terms of cross-border supply, in terms of consumption abroad, movement of natural persons. Again, this particular slide simply tells us that now there is more market liberalization in the Philippines over the years. The question is, what are the commitments that we have made so far, the Philippines as a country, with the rest of the ASEAN countries? In the area of life insurance, the Philippines has committed to open up this subsector related to ordinary group, industrial, health and accident, and annuities. Meaning that if I were an investor from Indonesia and I want to enter the Philippine market, because of this commitment by the Philippines, I'm very much aware that I will be given the preferential treatment when I try to enter these subsectors within the insurance market in the Philippines. In the area of non-life insurance, these are the different subsectors again that the Philippines has committed with the rest of the countries in the region. And I assume here that these different subsectors have been communicated with the private sector, because by the very fact that we have committed this in the region, That means that our own market should be able to accommodate any request from other countries to enter these particular subsectors. The problem here is that AFA's agreement is a legally binding agreement. Once the Philippines committed to these subsectors, that means there's no more backtracking. Otherwise, there will be some penalty under AFAS. Because under AFAS, we're assuming here that there is progressive liberalization. We don't need to backtrack. We have to continuously liberalize the sector. In the area of reinsurance and retrocession, again, the Philippines has committed in this in the subsector called reinsurance. The Philippines does not make any commitment in the area of insurance intermediation, but under services auxiliary to insurance, the Philippine commitments consist of actuarial consultancies and average adjusters, meaning that these are the different subsectors that the Philippines have agreed to open up over time. So since these commitments have already been made, any time from now, if there is an investor from Indonesia, Singapore, or Malaysia who may want to come here, then they should be able to say that they can enter these different subsectors because these are already committed by the Philippines. Let me just mention or talk about what do we expect by 2015 and beyond. The ASEAN finance ministers last year, as well as the ASEAN central bank governors, developed what they call the ASEAN Financial Integration Framework. Again, the idea is that they want to make sure that there is greater financial integration in ASEAN by 2015 and beyond. So they came up with this framework called AFIF. AFIF basically focuses on two important sectors. One is insurance sector, the other one is banking sector. Under the insurance sector, the idea is that from now until 2015, ASEAN countries, including the Philippines, should be able to achieve progressive liberalization of the insurance market, meaning that our own market, the Philippines, should be able to comply, should be able to commit more market opening with the rest of the world. So the idea is that by the end of 2015, there should be 6 packages of commitments that have to be completed by then. Again, these are commitments of market opening. And then from now until 2020, we expect market integration in the region to be realized. Again, we're not saying here that by 2020, everything will be fully integrated. The expectation here by the ASEAN finance ministers and the ASEAN central bank governors that there might be a semi-integrated ASEAN insurance market by 2020. The question now is, how do we achieve that? How do we ensure that there is integration of the insurance market by 2020? Here, we have to be very realistic. We have to look at what are the different preconditions that would allow integration of the insurance market to be realized. And by preconditions here, I'm referring to the development of regulatory standards and practices, for example, issues related to financial infrastructure and capacity building. But again, this particular slide just tells us that what basically is the expectation in terms of the ASEAN insurance market within the overall context of the AEC and beyond. Let me conclude by asking this same question that I think we always ask ourselves also within the ASEAN. Are we ready to face the AEC by 2015? My own personal sense is that I think we have to be ready as a country and as a region. Why? Because it is a reality, it is a fact that globalization is here to stay. We cannot reverse the forces of globalization. Both trade integration and both financial integration, the forces of trade integration and financial globalization are so strong that these forces are bound to happen whether we like it or not. I think that is the reality that all of us in the Philippines and also in other countries in ASEAN have to face. So the best thing to do now is that we need to leverage on these different forces that are already happening in the region and across the world. And one of these, of course, is the fact that there will be an AEC, there will be deeper market integration by 2015. So we cannot just stand and become a bystander and look at what's going to happen, but I think we have to do something. Of course, we also realize here that there are a lot of challenges involved. Market integration is a very difficult process. The fact that integration is already difficult to be achieved within the country, how much more within the region? So the challenges are basically there. And one of the important challenges, of course, is how do you address, for example, different regulatory standards and policies? Some countries have adopted a different supervisory regime and capital regime in the insurance market. How are we going to ensure that there is harmonization? So that is one of the things that we're trying to address in ASEAN. And at the same time, I think it is also very important that as we try to build all these preconditions for market integration to be realized, I think it is also, in my view, very important that the market players have to be ready to what's going to happen. Again, AEC is a market-driven process. Within ASEAN, we discuss so many issues among the different governments. But for me, my personal sense here is that at the end of the day, market integration is about the market, right? If the market is not able to understand what's going on, if the market does not comprehend what are the implications of this AEC, I don't think ASEAN or ASEAN Secretariat will be very successful in implementing the AEC. My personal view is that we have to make sure that the private sector like you is very much aware of what's going on. And this is the reason why within the ASEAN Secretariat, we do a very extensive public outreach. For example, my office is doing country consultations. We visit each country. We talk to policymakers. We talk to private sector like you to make sure that there is a very good understanding of what AEC. Unfortunately, in the Philippines, when we did our country consultation last year, it's very sad that the degree of awareness of what AEC is all about is very limited. I can say that because when we went to Thailand, for example, just last month, I was so amazed by the fact that everybody knows about what AEC. There is already an understanding of what AEC. Of course, there are still issues that they raise, but the fact that most of the people in Thailand know what is AEC, I think that is a good start, that we're on the right track. I'm hoping that in the Philippines, we get the same understanding, the same appreciation of the AEC. Again, we're not saying that AEC will solve everything by 2015. We're just simply saying here is that we have to be ready to the fact that there is greater market integration, there is greater market competition, there is greater market liberalization, that each individual business in ASEAN and in the Philippines should be able to address. With that, I thank you very much.